Future Workforce podcast by Time Doctor. My name's Ryan, and I'm here with today's guest, Jamie Beresford. Jamie is the CEO at Practice Protect, which is the #1 accounting-specific cybersecurity platform that makes it quick and easy to secure and control client data wherever your people work. Jamie, hello, and welcome to the show.
G'day, Ryan. How are you? Good to be here with you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. To get us started here, I want to start with you and help the listeners learn a little bit more about your expertise. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you made your way to being the CEO at Practice Protect?
Yeah, right. Well, that was easy becoming CEO because I started the business, so I just put CEO on my business card, and that was that. But that was 20 years ago. So yeah, look, a background in IT services, managed services, relevant to this conversation. In around about 2013, we started a remote team in the Philippines. I actually moved there with my family to start that side of the business, and then in around about 2019, we expanded that into South Africa. So we have an office in Durban to complement our office in Manila. And yeah, and I guess through that journey, we've evolved the product rather than being a sort of a broad managed services. We've narrowed the scope of what we do around software, and a much sort of more specific SaaS-based solution that suits accountants only. So yeah, long journey.
That's great. Thank you for that. And, you hit on something there that I think is really relevant to what we want to talk about today, that you've had a lot of experience with, and that I think would be a huge benefit to a lot of our listeners. And that's making the jump from onshore to offshore. You mentioned a couple different places that you expanded the organization out into. And with the way things are going right now, the landscape of work and how companies are starting to source talent, it's been changing for at least a decade now, but we've seen a massive acceleration in that change over the last 2 years or so due to the pandemic. So offshoring in particular, it's become a lot more attractive for a ton of different industries. So I think it'd be helpful if you could tell us a little bit about your experience making that transition. What was it like for you going from a fully in-person and onshore company to one that operates remotely and that leverages a lot of offshore talent?
Yeah, sure. And I can tell you about all the mistakes we made, which will probably help your audience, if anything. Like I said, we did it pretty rapidly. We sort of put a stake in the ground. And when I moved, as I said, I moved to Manila with my family. We just started recruiting with the intent that Manila would become our head office. There's a whole lot of things going on around in our industry at the time, and we needed to do something different. And that was kind of what we were going to do, just in order to be able to scale. I guess the reason more so was the fact that we knew we needed to change our offering because the cloud was disrupting what we did at that point in time. And the problem with doing something new is we were just too busy servicing the now. Okay, we just couldn't afford the resource. All of our resources onshore were just flat out busy, and we knew we needed to do something. And my thinking was, okay, well, if we can go and leverage the cost base and the scale using the Philippines, we would have some capacity, our knowledge onshore would have some capacity to start looking at what else we could be doing, as we knew we needed to pivot the business's product offering. Little did we know that there was a lot to be learned. It isn't just a matter of hiring new people. Let's face it, people are an X factor wherever you hire people. People look at us and say we're in the tech business. I think all businesses, we're in the people business. If you're not good at people and hiring, motivating, engaging people, you're nowhere. And whether that's onshore or offshore makes no difference. So offshore is no real difference. It's just a little bit harder because there's a couple of additional barriers to that point. One of them being the cultural aspect, and the way you are perceived as a foreigner. And also just there's different nuances and different skill sets. So for example, in those initial years, we had a very, what I'd call, tacit organization. I think we had about 12 team members at the time that had all been working together for many years, and we just kind of, it was a bit of a jack of all trades approach to roles where everybody just did whatever needed to be done. It was a services business, so you had inbound calls and sort of things that would come up on the fly, and we all just mucked in and kind of did it as the way most sort of startups operate. You just do whatever had to be done. Now, we tried to apply that offshore. It's the only way we really knew. We tried to do that in Manila, and it just failed dramatically. That initial business we'd lost, and within the first year, I think we'd lost 30% of our client base, just by simply modifying it, just ripping the service. So when clients were calling, they were calling a different office, and we didn't have our ducks in a row in the Philippines, and they had a bad experience and they were leaving. So we had to move pretty quickly. And one of the things we sort of had to do, and with the benefit of hindsight, is really start thinking like a large business, like a corporate, with far more specific roles. It's not a like for like transition. A level 2 engineer in Australia or the US cannot be replaced by a level 2 engineer in the Philippines. And that's why, when I hear people say, oh, you're offshoring jobs, and what about from a parochial or a sort of a nationalistic perspective, you're damaging the local economy and giving less opportunity to onshore people. It's just simply not true. The way we had to look at it was, what is distracting that level 2 engineer from solving the big issues, from providing the white glove service to our clients? Like, what admin is these guys doing? And kind of creating roles, going through our business and sweeping that 20% of time consuming tasks and creating PDs out of that, and getting really specific. Because generally speaking, and look, I do want to be careful here not to generalize, because I'm talking 4 out of 5. There are exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, particularly in the Philippines, it has been shaped by the call center industry, where and that's been going on for decades now, where generally an employee will see themselves as an agent, like a call center agent, and they'll have a very specific linear bunch of tasks and very clear KPIs that are really stringently monitoring them, and they go about executing their task as per the KPIs. Whereas the tasks generally onshore, the way we were approaching business at the time, was a lot broader than that.
Interesting. Yeah, you mentioned that it's growing pains, just like with any organization, but there's some really unique ones, and I'm glad you brought up the culture and some of those things. Also, the nature of the business. You bring up outsourcing, and we work with a ton of outsourcers, but I think it's something that is becoming a little bit more narrow in focus when you look at a BPO versus a KPO, and some of the other knowledge processing things that are happening and moving to offshore right now. So while you mentioned some of the general challenges that you faced, I'm wondering if we can dig in a little bit deeper and talk about some of the specifics for you and scaling your business, specifically in IT, specifically in technology, and what you went through there. What can you tell us about the biggest challenges that you faced, and maybe some talk a little bit about how you overcame those?
I think communicating a lot more formally, getting a lot more formal as a business owner. And look, I'm reflecting on a long time ago now, when we were a very kind of, in hindsight, a relatively immature business. I look back on some of the things I'm about to tell you, and I think, well, shit, it's pretty elementary stuff. We didn't have our roles defined properly. We not to the level of detail that we needed to have, so that people understood exactly what we expected from them. And I mean down to the mathematical. Nowadays, every single role in our business has either 4 or 5 different KPIs that account for either 20 or 25% of, whether it's 4 or 5 of, in a specific scoring system, almost like a report card that you had at school. And that all equates to a number, and that number at the bottom equates specifically to the salary increase of that team member on their review every year. You know, that's the level of detail that we've gotten to in, you know, 8 years of learning. At the start, it was just, great, you're a level 2 engineer, jump in that chair over there and start answering the phone. Here's how our systems work. I'll sit next to you and we'll just, away we go. That was one of the challenges. The other one was probably that working culture of not really having as broader an understanding of the company's objectives or the company's, the business in general. The approach from a team member's perspective is generally, what's my role? What do you expect of me? Whereas I was used to team members who sort of got the business. They said, okay, it's an MSP. We understand what an MSP does. And that was challenging to start with because, you know, you had people that would, you know, on the dot, like, you know, they'd walk out of the office on their lunch break or whatever when the phone was ringing, and things that we would assume that, you know, that just didn't happen in our onshore office. But the mindset was very different. It was like, well, my lunch break is at 1 p.m. until 2 p.m. No matter what's going on, I could be mid phone call. I'm walking out the door at that time. That getting our heads around that and understanding how to work with that was new. There's, you know, that was probably the main thing. The having to narrow up our roles and define the roles specifically, from, instead of looking at a like-for-like role, chopping out that 20% of several roles onshore and building a role out of that, and then just tackling that kind of, you know, almost big business mentality from team members where there's not as much of a kind of a buy-in to the company. And look, you know, this has evolved, and I don't want to kind of, like I say, generalize, because over time we've learned, and we do have that buy-in now, by and large. But at the time, it wasn't, and it was very, very challenging, because at the end of the day, we were just a foreigner operating in this company. They had no understanding of what my background was, or what we were about, or really what, you know, how the business went. You know, if we lost a client, that wasn't relevant to them. It was, they have their objectives, and it's nothing to do with really the business's objectives. And that was one of the challenges at the start.
Yeah, it's you say elementary, but I think this is a lot of stuff that you can only learn by being involved in it, right? So people who are just getting started, I think that's a ton of valuable information for them in some of the blind spots that they might not anticipate when going offshore and trying to scale something in that global way. So, you know, I wanted to see, as for the companies that are looking into outsourcing or offshoring, and I'm curious, how do you feel that offshoring, you know, utilizing outsourced talent, how do you feel that helps someone gain a competitive advantage? You know, what makes it attractive and makes it a positive differentiator for businesses?
Well, it's a huge differentiator for us now, and simply because we have the scale and the availability for our clients, we can deliver a far higher level of service to our clients. We no longer have the constraints around having team members available as we did onshore. The benefits are definitely there. If you're asking me what I would do differently, which is probably something that's going to really be able to help your audience, I would have slowed down. The first bit's the hardest. You're going to learn a lot in those first 4 to 6 months. So I would have defined specifically what I wanted, what at the task level, forget roles, actual tasks. Define what tasks I wanted to have moved offshore, build roles around that task, and just take my time and spend the first 4 to 6 months getting 2 or even 4 team members, depending on how much volume or throughput is in those specific tasks, and getting those right, because that's where you go through the culture, learnings. You know, especially if you haven't worked remotely with team members before, training remotely is difficult. You're probably going to have to travel at some point, get over there and you know, go and party with them or do whatever, build those relationships and just slow down and accept that the first 4 to 6 months is going to be an investment and that it is going to take longer, and you're going to learn more about your own processes in the absence of that tacit knowledge sharing. You're going to have to get really specific about what you do. You're probably going to have to implement workflow tools to measure throughput in your business if you don't already. Yeah, that bit, but the rewards are there, right? Because once you get that first seed built and you have those first 3 or 4 team members trained and in the groove, you can then add to that really quickly. You can start to build out those roles, and then your onshore team will start to understand, oh, okay, they're doing this really well, way better than I used to do it. Let's start to look at what else we can push over there. And then it just all really starts happening. In hindsight, the first 2 years of learning and all those clients we lost, we should have got to that point within 6 months. We could have done it a lot smarter and a lot better.
You make a great point there about making sure that offshore is meshing well with what's going on onshore, and being sure to talk about the benefits, talk about the advantages that it brings to the company, and get everybody on the same page as far as what the offshore team is providing. I think that's really important to set the stage and get everyone feeling like, hey, this is really important for our business, for our growth, and for us performing at a higher level. So I'm glad you bring that up. Just to get in and add a little bit more practical advice, which you gave some good stuff there, but I wanted to see, for anyone who's thinking about that transition process, somebody who is committed to leveraging offshore talent, what are their some best practices for them for engaging and managing a global workforce? You mentioned getting there on person. You mentioned taking them out, having a good time with them, those sorts of things. Is there anything else that you would offer as advice to people who are getting ready to make that transition?
Yeah, well, before you start to make that transition is the important part, because that's about getting your processes organized. And I'm sure Time Doctor have some great content on all of this. This is all, there's Process Street. I believe you guys use Process Street internally. You probably think you might have your processes documented, whether they're at the level to be documented or to be as clear on how you do things. You'll get exposed if you don't have that right. You'll realize that you actually, a lot of things in your business happen, and when you actually get asked, well, how does that happen? It's like, whoa, I have to go back a step and explain that. Having that documented, lots of recording videos, a huge investment in training. I guess that's another thing. Make sure you've got the availability. The fun bit's hiring, right? When you start seeing these guys and you're like, wow, these guys are going to be awesome. They're really friendly and these CVs look great. They've come from, a company that's similar to mine. That's the fun part. Actually rolling your sleeves up and getting on Zoom and getting on a plane for those first sort of 4 to 6 months, that becomes a grind after a while, and you've got to have the capacity in your business at the time. You've got to word up the specific people who are responsible for that and say, hey, this is your project for the next 4 to 6 months, and you're going to have some patience, because there is an investment there initially. Then there's just you've got your asynchronous comms. You've got to get a little bit better than that. You don't have the luxury of tapping each other on the shoulder around the office. Often global team members are much more akin to messaging than phone calls, conversations. So you've got to get good at Loom. You've got to get good at that asynchronous side of conversing and communicating. From an engagement perspective, I learned that there's a difference between career progression and salary progression. Now, in certain areas, and look, I think it just comes down to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You've got to empathize with the fact that it's a very different world that people in different parts of the world live in. And while generally speaking, your motivation is, okay, I'm going to take you to, here's where you are, here's where we're going as a company, buy into our values, buy into our culture. We're going to take you there. You're going to be awesome. We're going. But it's like, no, how much am I going to get paid? But can I have X amount more, and initially you'd be, you'd kind of take not offense, but you'd be taken aback by that. Be like, hang on, man, I'm going to make you awesome. Like I'm going to, you're going to grow your career. You're going to have these credentials. Like, no, I have a family to feed right now. And it's brass tacks is important. And we realized that all of these sort of improvement plans and all of this kind of altruistic stuff is important, but it doesn't compare to brass tacks. Okay. And that's where the KPIs come in, because you've got to line up performance specifically and show exactly how team members can improve their brass tacks at the end of the year. And you've got to accept the fact that there's other priorities in some people's lives. And it's not all about your business and your business growth and your culture and values, and understanding that difference between salary progression and career progression. Apart from that, looking at your offering, so I mentioned that we've changed our whole business around this. So, and we still have the managed services business, but we evolved because what we learned pretty quickly is we had very unique strengths and weaknesses compared to our onshore competitors. We could no longer compete in niche, complex tech. And that is simply because of the fact that, you got to remember, we're very fortunate in the US, Australia, Europe, where we were exposed to really good technology as kids. We have amazing education, amazing exposure, mentorship, all of that stuff. We take all of that for granted, and generally speaking, you don't have the depth. It is, like I say, there's an exception to the rule, but generally speaking, you don't have the depth of technical knowledge or the skills. It's what we learned quickly was we can't compete in complex tech anymore. We're going to actually have to, because we can compete scaling simplicity and a really positive customer experience. So in our game, that meant user support. We have a really good user support and a really good experience for the user. And strangely enough, that is really valuable because people are so pissed off at getting shit service when they're calling their ISP, calling their telco, sitting on hold, talking to automated systems. The huge advantage there, and going back to your initial question, Ryan, around the advantage there, having that availability and being able to reset a password within 2 minutes and give them a really solid experience. Whereas an onshore team member hates doing that sort of stuff. They're kind of more involved. So we've changed our whole product offering, and that's where we pivoted from being a deep, complex services business to a product, which is a far more simpler and scalable product to sell, software, SaaS. Clients are no longer saying, hey, my internet connection doesn't work. It's either my router or my laptop, and a really complex process of elimination to troubleshoot that issue. We now have a product that only has about 15 to 20 requests that somebody can call in about, and we have that documented to the teeth. And I'm probably relevant, our journey, I talked about the start and all the challenges. I think I'm underselling, because there was a lot of value to come after that. And by being in the Philippines, we started working with BPOs and providing tech services for companies based in the Philippines. And that became our niche for a while. And so we learned a lot, saw firsthand as the IT provider, how a lot of different companies were working well offshore and through that process. And then we evolved that into the product which we now are, because security was the big issue with especially accounting firms. Accounting firms are actually quite forward when it comes to offshoring, and the big concern for them was securing security. Oh my God, I'm about to put my client's information in the hands of these people that I don't have physical supervision over. Security became a big issue, and then we identified that niche, and then the rest is history. That was around about 2016, 2017, and we still have the managed services business. We don't provide IT services to BPO anymore, but that security for offshore companies became security for accounting firms, and that's been a lot. So I guess that's a really long way of explaining that we actually changed our product, changed what we did around our unique value proposition. So understanding what our weaknesses are, understanding what our strengths are, and building a business around that. We also tapped out a little because we have our knowledge in Australia and the US, like our high level exec team and our kind of, R&D product design, and we have a really strong service experience in the Philippines, but we were missing this middle piece in the middle, and that was what South Africa did for us. And we went to South Africa around about 2019, and that's just really been fantastic, because and it's horses for courses. And even from a cost perspective, you know, an SA team member is going to cost you double what a PH team member is going to cost, and then an onshore team member is going to cost you double what an SA, if not more, of what an SA team member was. So, you know, I guess it's to simplify all of that, it's what you don't do. You know, we were starting to push PH team members outside of their area of expertise and what was their core competency, and it was really slow going. We succeeded, but not at the scale that we needed to, and that's where we found that South Africa piece, and that was the missing link in that journey.
Yeah, that's big. You know, it's self-awareness is a huge key, it sounds like, and not just at the company level, but at the individual level, knowing your role and being able to execute at it, understanding what you're good at, executing. And I love that you mentioned money, right? Don't overthink it, right? Money matters. So make sure that you're in the right place with that as well. And you're understanding where your people are too. So tons of great advice there. Really appreciate you sharing your background and your experiences and moving to an offshore operation. Before we let you go, Jamie, I wanted to see, you know, what's one big takeaway, if you could leave the listener with just one thing to bring with them as they consider offshoring or as they go through their transition offshoring, what would that be?
It's about tasks, not roles. Yeah, get more granular. What's the volume of work? Do an ROI on your existing business and look at it. And look, we've built a whole business over there. We actually moved the core of our business to global. You may be a large firm that has a whole lot of onshore team members processing things that, you know, performing low-level, time-consuming tasks, and you could really improve the working lives of those people by giving them resources and team members that can perform that repetitive or time-consuming aspects of their business. And that tends to happen in the finance function a lot. You can really transform the working lives of team members by chopping up those roles and sort of building roles out of the bottom 20% of other roles.
Love it. Thanks so much for that. Last thing before we go, where can listeners who want to learn more about you, Practice Protect, where can they go find you?
Yeah, sure. practiceprotect.com, cybersecurity for accountants. Yeah, that's probably the best place to start.
Excellent. And we'll include the details in the show notes for the episode. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us and talking a little bit about offshoring with us today. Appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Ryan.